The OSI teaches that everything in the universe happens according to the grand plan. But the stranger that arrived in Halcyon was an unplanned variable. From the moment he landed in Emerald Vale, his actions altered the course of history. The riots in Tartarus ended in a total victory for the board. Without any significant threats to challenge their power, the board asserted their control over the colony. The lifetime employment program began immediately, and the people of Halcyon did exactly what they were expected to do. They obeyed. Sophia Akande converted the labyrinth from a prison to a processing center. She jettisoned the original colonists out of the Hope and transformed the ship into a massive storage facility. One by one, the workers of Halcyon surrendered themselves to the program. They arrived with their families and their friends, their colleagues and their neighbors, and then, one by one, they marched into their stasis chambers. As the workers of Halcyon slept in their hibernation chambers, their settlements became ghost towns, left behind by the board to be reclaimed by nature. Only Byzantium remained, a shining beacon of civilization in an otherwise abandoned colony. The people of Byzantium spent the rest of their days gorging themselves on their stockpile of resources. As for the workers of Halcyon, they never felt the effects of the collapse. They never felt anything at all. With the board shuttering many of its smaller townships, Graham was never able to spread his ideals to Byzantium. On Monarch, however, the iconoclast movement swelled, forming the colony's hotbed of philosophical thought and freedom, a consistent counterpoint to the board's capitalist regime. Or so they viewed themselves, at least. The Byzantium elite find it endearing that those anarchistic hoopleheads are still allowed to breathe Halcyon air. Over the years, the ruins of Edgewater caused irreversible environmental damage to the landscape of Emerald Vale, owing largely to the presence of toxic compounds in the town's building materials. As for Edgewater's former workers, their remains provided a source of nourishment for the region's fauna, leading to an explosion in the sprat population. Without the commanding leadership of Junlei Tennyson, the groundbreaker teetered on the verge of corporate control. The ship's independence eroded until it was nothing but another symbolic brand. Once engineering and life support fell into board hands, the people began to accept that their home was no longer their own. As smaller settlements were swallowed up and their workers drafted into the lifetime employment program, Byzantium continued to thrive. While its citizens lived in decadence and extravagance, a small cadre of scientists worked to solve the nutrition crisis that threatened Halcyon. No one else much noticed the townships that disappeared from the map, or the luxuries that slowly lost their luster year by year. Even the Gorgone asteroid, though a distant enigma to most of Halcyon, felt the aftershocks of your actions. Gorgone's restored facilities presented a tantalizing boon to the lifetime employment program. The promise of a more productive, more compliant workforce. It was too good for Akande to pass up, especially when Tartarus and the many underperforming townships across Terra 2 offered fodder for additional research. Unfortunately, the lack of capable leadership left the project in even worse shape than it had been under Dr. Ambrose. As Halcyon's population dwindled, Gorgone churned out one failed formula after another, and marauders overran the empty settlements of Terra 2. With Project Gorgone under his command, Lucien Bancroft had everything he needed: a laboratory, Ambrose Manor, and an endless supply of human test subjects. Above all, he had no ethical qualms about the nature of his work. Lucien did well for himself in Akande's new vision of Halcyon. In spite of everything, the Gorgone asteroid remained a sobering reminder of the potential for progress and disaster in humanity's most ambitious efforts. Administrator Ludovico never lived to see the launch of Spectrum Brown. It happened in a private event in Byzantium to an elite gathering of dilettantes who wanted to sample the drink that killed Halcyon Helen. Spectrum Brown was briefly popular in the months following the lifetime employment program, but fell out of favor once Byzantines realized it couldn't dull the inevitable onset of ennui. The sheer volume of substances consumed by the average Byzantine had the effect of countering the parasite's influence. Host to the parasite rarely turned violent, and the few who did were discreetly rounded up and deposited outside the walls. The lifetime employment program led to a boom in the aetherwave industry, as more and more Byzantines demanded entertainment. With the absence of Ruth Bellamy, the question on everyone's mind was, who could be the next Halcyon Helen? Burbage 3001's performance during the investigation on Eridanos made it the ideal contender for Helen's replacement. Some years later, after Odeon Pictures released the brand new Burbage 3002 model, it was found mysteriously destroyed by a plasma weapon. Cedric Kincannon quietly disappeared in the aftermath of the Eridanos incident. As unlikely as it would be for Cedric to have slipped off-world before the infection claimed Eridanos, no one has ever seen him among the waves of madly grinning infected plaguing the colony. Curiously, no one has ever seen Cedric's former secretary, Eileen, among the infected either. After Spectrum Brown's widespread distribution, Spencer Woolrich experienced a sudden upswing in his popularity. Viewers found his on-screen conduct to be more boisterous, energetic, and personable than ever before. The wide grin constantly beaming from his narrow face certainly helped fit his friendly image. When asked about his newfound on-screen charisma, Spencer had this to say: "Happy workers lead to happy customers. Happy customers are repeat customers." Bertie Holcomb adapted to his new role as a host for parasitic slugs surprisingly well. Perhaps because he wasn't using his brain for all that much in the first place. The slugs put a swift, if unorthodox, end to Bertie's fears of being valued solely for his toss-ball skills. Of all the infected in the colony, Bertie's wild, beaming smile would always be the most genuine. The prophet of profitability was not spared from the infection quickly overtaking Eridanos. Due to her newfound chronic delight, the prophet was no longer able to effectively advise her clients on productivity. Her disciples, similarly bliss-enwrapped, lost interest in the hot, cold walks and hourly purges. Despite all this, the prophet's spirits were hardly dampened. After all, she no longer had the capacity to worry about any of her business rivals. After you killed her parents, Ellie left the Unreliable. She returned to her old life in the Groundbreaker's orbit, but her days of mischief and nights of carousal had lost their appeal. She found herself taking bigger and more foolish risks, but something irrevocable had changed. Clyde Harlow and his gang of pirates never had the chance to go down in a blaze of defiance. The deteriorating state of the colony took its toll, and they fell into mutiny when their supplies ran low. Felix was not one of the crew killed in that mutiny. He disappeared, only to reappear a year later in board custody. Out of respect for his previous services, Sophia Akande spared his life and added him to the lifetime employment program instead. He remains in suspended animation to this day. As a reward for his part in her courageous rescue, the adjutant invited the vicar, known as Max, to become one of the leaders of the Order of Scientific Inquiry. Max eventually rose to the top, becoming the presiding bishop of the OSI. He denounced his spiritual meanderings as a misguided attempt to come to terms with his long-dead parents. His only regret was that they had not lived long enough to see that he was right all along. Parvati didn't survive her adventure with you. Before his untimely death, Captain Alex Hawthorne had plans to restore and modify, for combat purposes, a sanitation and maintenance automechanical that he'd found in a state of disrepair in Emerald Vale's scrapyard. That unit remains broken down and forgotten in the Unreliable supply closet to this day. Though Minister Clark was eventually released from house arrest, long years of isolation left him a changed man, little suited for bureaucratic work or for the colony that was changing around him. He remained in his estate largely by choice, fading from public view. Adjutant Sophia Akande was instrumental in executing the Lifetime Employment Program. While the rest of Byzantium celebrated, Sophia returned to work. She devoted herself to ensuring that Byzantium remained prosperous for many generations to come, and to finding an answer to Earth's silence. With Halcyon's workers suspended in a state of hibernation, starvation and chaos are problems of the past. The Lifetime Employment Program succeeded in its goals, but that success came at a price. The Halcyon of today is nothing at all like the colony of yesteryear. Power remains concentrated in Byzantium, but all the colony's resources serve the lifestyle of the elite, thereby transforming Halcyon into one of the smallest and most exclusive colonies in the system. And what about you, the unplanned variable in the history of Halcyon? After you rescued her in Tartarus, Sophia Akande offered you any reward you could imagine. Power, wealth, influence. However, you were more interested in the simple pleasures in life, like the smooth, artificially enhanced flavor of a Rizzo's Purple Berry Munch. Rizzo's Purple Berry Munch, the only snack in Halcyon, officially endorsed by the captain of the Unreliable. No one knows what's happened to Earth, and no one knows what the future has in store for Halcyon. All we know for certain is this: the name of the Unreliable and that of its intrepid captain will remain the subject of countless stories for years to come.